Their belief is if the Americans could be kicked out of the region, then Iran, as the largest population and the greatest military power, could in time kind of roll over all of the other local powers. And it's not that I think this is a dumb position. I think it's actually a fairly good read of the history of the region. Iran, Persia as we used to call it, would expand out every few generations and conquer most of the area. But the Iran of today is not the same as the Persia of old. The Persia of old was a polyglot, multi-ethnic empire in which everyone was basically encouraged to define themselves as Persian. It was, if you will, the United States of the day. It included everyone from everywhere. Every valley had its own identity, and they all worked together towards a Persian goal. Now, we're still talking about the Middle Ages and before. It's not that people weren't beaten or anything like that. And it's not like this was a democracy, but it was relatively egalitarian. What happened in the Age of Empires, however, is that the Europeans came in with their deep water navigation and basically cut Iran out of the entire world. They had been the nexus for what passed as global trade. But as soon as the Portuguese and the Spanish figured out how to bypass this entire region and go interface with the Spice Islands and the Chinese directly, all of a sudden Iran became a nowhere. And all of the wealth that used to flow into it went away, the egalitarianism went away, the wealth went away, the cosmopolitanism went away, and the Iran of today is an empty shell compared to what it was. Now, into this environment, about a century ago, the Iranians discovered oil. And they went from having one of the most sophisticated, varied economies in the world to all of a sudden being a rentier state, where there was just one commodity that brought in money and, honestly, invading armies. And Iran ceased being significant. Iran of the Ayatollahs wants the glory days back, but they don't understand that they need to start from scratch and rebuild the cosmopolitan that used to undergird the old Persian Empire, and that is a century, a 2-century, a 3-century process. So they're stuck with the economy of today and the political system of yesteryear, and that is just not a good combination. So that's kind of piece one, people who are chomping at the bit to get back to the glory days, but they really lack the tools. And so what they do is they just work to undermine the systems of everybody else, cause chaos in order to tear down opposing systems so theirs can rise. On the other side, you've got the Saudis, which are, the Saudis are probably some of the least egalitarian people in the world. We've got there a single family, the Al Sauds, who think of themselves as medieval despots of old, divine right of kings, that sort of thing, and how everyone in their country basically exists to serve their needs. They look at the Persians with concern because in times the Persians have conquered what is today Saudi Arabia, but really it's a lot more visceral than that. The Saudis and their allies, the Wahhabis, used to be desert raiding tribes. They never had much going on. They basically existed by kidnapping and drug smuggling. And then they rose to control this territory that we know as Saudi Arabia, and shortly thereafter, they discovered oil. And so you take this mindset that is kind of the worst of all worlds and all of a sudden make it fabulously wealthy. So there's not a lot of work ethic. There's no technical skills. They bring in foreigners to do everything, but they're mad rich. These are the two forces that are now opposed to each other in the Middle East. And the United States, during the Cold War, managed to make both of them allies. And in the post-Cold War order, managed to keep the Saudis as an ally when they lost the Iranians. Well, that is what the American presence is what has made the Persian Gulf region so calm for the last 70 years. And I got to underline that. Despite all the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia and Syria, this is the calmest period in this region's history. And the only reason it's been relatively calm is the Americans had to have the oil flowing to power the global order. Now that the Americans don't care, now that the Americans are leaving, this region goes back to the old rivalries. And these two powers, Iran and Saudi Arabia, are going to be at each other's throats very soon. You could actually argue that the civil war in Syria is kind of the opening gambit in this conflict. The Saudis and the Iranians have backed opposite sides. The Iranians get a lot of flack in the United States for being hyper-violent. They are, but they're not nearly as violent as what the Saudis have done. Because at the end of the day, the Iranians actually want to rule this region. And so they've worked with the standing government of Bashar Assad. The Saudis don't. They know that no one in the region respects them. They know that they lack the institutional capacity to actually rule this region. So they're willing to burn it down, burn it all down if that hurts Iran. So when you look at all these conflicts that are simmering in the region, in Syria and Afghanistan, in Iraq and Yemen, this is what they are in a moment of calm. When the Saudis still have some hope that the Americans are going to remain engaged and impose some sort of stability on the region from the outside. As soon as the Saudis give up on that hope, the gloves come off and this gets serious. I would argue that the Iranians are doing everything that they can, that they're, if anything, overexposed right now. So their ability to surge violence into this region, I don't think it exists. That doesn't mean that they're done by any stretch of the imagination, but I think they've pushed as hard as they possibly can. They might be able to maintain this tempo, but I don't think they can increase it. The Saudis absolutely can. The Saudis conservatively have $2 trillion saved up in their sovereign wealth funds, not all of which is on the books. They also, every once in a while, prune minor branches of the family tree and throw princes in prison and take all their cash. So their ability to ramp up what they're doing is extreme. Keep in mind that some of the backroom, quiet militant groups that the Saudis have spawned and unleashed upon their enemies in the past include groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda. So their capacity for it, just with a few weeks' notice to go up and stir up a lot of trouble, throw a lot of cash at a militant group, provide them with a little bit of intelligence and weapons, that's almost bottomless. And the only reason it hasn't been more is because they think that the Americans might not be ready to leave. Now, as soon as the Americans do formally leave, they're going to try to find a new sponsor, but really there aren't a lot of players. The Europeans and the Asians really don't have the staying power to play a role, and certainly don't have the deployable militaries in terms of getting a large army to the region to make a difference. Turkey's a possibility, but honestly, the Turks think as badly of the Saudis, I think, as I do. The best bet is probably Israel. Israel is of the firm belief that if we can get various members of the Islamic world fighting each other, then they're not going to have the spare bandwidth to go after the Jewish state. And that's probably a really good plan. So they're providing already the Saudis with weapons training, with some equipment that the Americans won't give them, with time on target intelligence. They're stirring up groups around the region in parallel with the Saudis to a little degree. Geopolitics makes strange bedfellows. Well, the Israelis and the Saudis are never going to have a signed document, and there's never, ever going to be an Israeli base in Saudi Arabia. They've done a very good job at keeping this relatively low profile from a PR point of view, but it's pretty safe to say that most of the Arab world nations today actually prefer working with Israel to Iran. They don't see the Israelis as wanting to conquer them, and that makes all the difference.